So I approach the question posed tonight: why is the workers' share of the economic pie shrinking? From quite a different perspective to Greg, and really from one that looks at power relations in the workplace. And there is some great framing of this approach in another recent book by a UK industrial relations academic, Jane Holgate, called Arise, Power, Strategy and Union Resurgence, which I recommend to anyone interested. So the answer, put simply, as to why wages have been held down for so long, as Greg has so clearly articulated, is because workers don't have the power anymore to demand their fair share. And we're all familiar with the factors that have contributed to this diminution in workers' bargaining power over the last 30 years. As Greg put it, it's not an accident, it is a design. And it's part of the neoliberal project here and globally. It's a result of all the deregulation and the globalization and the wave after wave of economic restructuring. It's a product of falling union membership, which is something I look at closely in my book that Fernanda mentioned, and that we've gone in Australia from over 50% union density in the mid-1980s to around 14% 2 years ago, last time it was measured. It's a result of the increases in insecure and precarious forms of work, casuals, fixed term, independent contracting, genuine contracting and sham contracting like we see in the gig economy. It's arisen because employers have evolved through new business models, labour hire, franchising, supply chains, platforms. All of these have been part of that project to keep wages down by distancing businesses from responsibility for minimum employment standards and from having to deal with unions or collective bargaining. But also the reason workers can no longer claim their fair share of wages is that we've also had the gradual erosion of traditional labour law supports for unions to organise and build power at the workplace. Laws that enabled workers to engage in collective bargaining from a position of strength, including through industrial action. So all these things have combined, and the result is that we see enterprise agreement coverage plummeting in Australia from 27% of employees working under a current enterprise agreement in 2012 to just 15% last year. And this matters because enterprise bargaining is the main way that most workers are able to obtain above award wage increases. So if bargaining is not happening, then workers are stuck on awards or the national minimum wage. So I want to focus a bit on some of the key problems in our labour laws that contribute to holding wages down. And I think we have this incredible opportunity of this new Labor government that can actually do something about this. And I think the starting point here is that this Labor government, and I see encouraging signs of this already, it must learn the lesson from 2009, and it cannot buy into the inevitable business carry-on about industrial relations reform. Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard capitulated to that kind of employer backlash. And the result is the Fair Work Act that we have now. And that legislation is full of Labor's compromises to keep business happy. So it was all about, yes, restoring fairness after the inequity of work choices, but it was balanced by flexibility for employers. And you see it in almost every part of the legislation. And so 13 years later, we have the worst of all worlds. We have legislation that offers insipid support for workers to bargain for better paying conditions. And even that compromised set of laws, employers have come up with new strategies to avoid it, to avoid the weak provisions compelling collective bargaining. And the Fair Work Commission, which we know has become very top heavy with coalition and business appointments, has helped employers out in that project, as have the courts. So the first year of this first term of the Albanese government is the time to rewrite the Fair Work Act with the goal of rebuilding collective worker power. And you need to start with reform of the bargaining system, because we don't have support for genuine collective bargaining in this legislation. We've got a framework of enterprise bargaining where employers make agreements with employees and unions play a role if they're strong enough. And we know that varies across industries and workplaces. So Labor's election policy said it would address some of the glaring problems in the Fair Work Act. I mentioned some of the employer strategies to get around it. And one of them that employers have utilised a lot is when negotiating a new agreement, they apply to the Fair Work Commission to have the current agreement, which continues in operation until a new one is made, have it terminated by the Commission. Where that happens, workers are pushed back onto awards and it tilts the bargaining negotiations in the favour of the employer. And even the threat of a termination of a current agreement can have that effect. And Qantas, our great Australian airline that's had the worst pandemic ever in terms of how it's treated workers, used this tactic in bargaining for a new agreement with cabin crew in March this year, threatened to terminate the existing agreement at the Fair Work Commission, and the result was a new agreement that locked in a 2-year pay freeze and new rostering flexibility for the airline. So Labor will address that and will improve the good faith bargaining provisions. Those sort of things will help, but we need to more fundamentally transform bargaining. And we need to do that through multi-employer or industry-wide bargaining. And this is something that's in Labor's platform, but isn't being talked about a lot openly at this point. I think it's being worked on behind the scenes, but I do think there is a Labor concern about this is an area where there will be backlash from business. So what's the problem that needs to be fixed here? It is that enterprise bargaining, that in many ways great project of the Hawke and Keating Labor governments, it was designed 30 years ago for an economy that just doesn't exist anymore. Workers and unions can only take industrial action and bargain for an agreement with a single business that directly employs the workforce. So that worked fine when we had lots of large work sites like factories where thousands of employees worked for the same employer. But businesses in important economic sectors like food production, logistics, building management, big box retail, they've all hived off large parts of their operations to other entities. That could be a labour hire company or some other form of outsourced provider of part of their service. But because bargaining is limited to the direct employer of the workers, the union can only get an agreement, for example, covering one supermarket operator, but not a deal that covers all of the supermarkets or that goes further and tries to get at the lead businesses at the apex of supply chains. So a union might want to try and get an agreement that covers transport, distribution, and the farms in the fresh food supply chain. You can't do that at the moment. So we need to reconfigure bargaining to allow for multi-employer agreements that overcome these business models. And if workers are going to be able to have their wages lifted, then we need the boost to bargaining power that comes from being able to negotiate and strike across industries. There's so much international evidence that shows that countries with sectoral or industry bargaining systems have higher rates of bargaining coverage and therefore higher wages for workers than countries like ours or the United States or the UK that have bargaining systems focused on the enterprise or the company. So a key issue if we're going to move to industry or multi-employer bargaining is how do we work out whether that should occur? And in my view, it has to be based on the principle that the workers decide the level on which they want to bargain. They want to be able to bargain with the economic units that influence whether they get pay increases or not. But you do have to have a way of determining what do workers want, what is their preference in terms of the level at which they want to bargain. And generally in our laws, we've done this by saying, well, it's a majority vote. But a majority of everyone in an industry could be, thousands or even hundreds of thousands of workers. Those kinds of tests are unattainable. And so I think instead of this idea of majority support for what kind of agreement, we need to move to a concept of legitimacy. How much should a union have to point to in terms of support from the workforce in order to get an agreement for workers at the level they want? So across an entire industry, that might only be 1,000 employees or 10% of the workforce. They are the kind of tests that New Zealand has put in place in legislation proposing to establish their new system of fair pay agreements, which would actually be something more like our award system rather than a collective bargaining type of system. Let me just say a few things about industrial action. There's a lot that needs fixing here. We don't have anything close to a proper right to strike. There's only one context in which industrial action is lawful or what we call protected under our legislation, and that's when workers are bargaining for a new enterprise agreement. But even that small window has been narrowed by the Fair Work Commission in rulings, for example, suspending protected industrial action. An employer can try and get industrial action knocked off if it's going to have some impact on public welfare, basically. So one example is last month, aged care providers were able to delay scheduled 5-hour stoppages by United Workers Union members because this was judged to threaten the lives or welfare of residents. Now, the union had set up the industrial action so that wouldn't happen, but the Fair Work Commission still prevented it from happening. And keep in mind that aged care workers are among the lowest paid in the country. We have a Royal Commission that's told us we need to do something about that. So how are they supposed to win a pay rise if they can't even take what other workers in certain circumstances can do, and that is legally strike? So we have to close that loophole. And we also have to get rid of the complex ballot requirements that the Howard government brought in and the last Labor government kept for industrial action, which only serve the interests of employers, give them more opportunities to turn up to the tribunal and prevent industrial action from happening. And workers have to be able to take political protest action. It can't be the case in modern Australia that it's illegal to leave work to attend a union rally or to walk out when the employer has made half the workforce redundant. You can't do those things in Australia. The last thing I want to focus on is combating insecure work. So insecure work is a problem not only because of the lower pay and the lack of job security that casuals and other precarious workers have to deal with, they're also in a much weaker position when it comes to unionising and bargaining. So combating insecure work is a key part of rebuilding worker power. We had the ridiculous spectacle at the start of the election campaign of the coalition and employers denying yet again that insecure work even exists. So their argument was that unions and the Labor Party were exaggerating claims about the increasing number of casuals. Whether the rate of casualisation has gone up or not, and I did say this during the campaign, casuals make up around 23% of the workforce. That's about 2.4 million people. Many of them are permanent casuals. They work regular hours every week for the same employer, sometimes for years on end. And the only thing that came out of the coalition government's IR reform process, which you might remember 2 years ago, people were calling it the New Accord during the pandemic. The only thing that came out of that were amendments to the Fair Work Act that enable employers to lock in an employer's casual status at the start of employment, regardless of whether they end up working a regular pattern of hours or how long they work for the employer. shutting casuals out of ever accessing leave entitlements. That change was accompanied by very weak casual conversion provisions, which employers can get around because you can reject a casual's request to convert to permanent on reasonable business grounds. So, for example, The Guardian reported in November that only 1% of university casuals were deemed eligible for conversion under these laws. So that has to be fixed in Labor's reforms. We have to change the definition of casual in the Fair Work Act so it only captures irregular short-term work. And we have to make that test based on the reality of the working relationship and not based on a contract that's shoved in front of someone on day one of the job, drafted by the employer's lawyer, that locks them out of permanent employment indefinitely. That's the state of our current law. We also have to restore labour hire to its original purpose, which was really about meeting short-term genuine demands for labour, replacing people on leave, for example. And so Labor has a commitment to do that by legislating the principle of same job, same pay for labour hire workers. And we've got to end the racket of gig work. We have to stop digital platforms using technology as a ruse for exploitation